The morning Harvey Wallace found the plate on his windowsill, he stood in the cold blue light of Christmas dawn and did not move for a full 2 minutes, because in 34 years of living, no one had ever done anything like that for him before. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because to understand what that plate meant to Harvey Wallace, you have to understand what kind of man he was before Pearl Bristol rode into Caldwell, Kansas in the autumn of 1882, and changed every single quiet, lonely thing about his life. Harvey Wallace was a man built for solitude, or so everyone in Caldwell believed, and so Harvey himself had long since accepted. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with hands that bore the permanent calluses of a working man, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red sandstone that jutted out of the Kansas earth. His hair was dark brown, shot through with early threads of gray at the temples, and his eyes were the particular shade of gray-green that the sky turned just before a serious storm. He was 34 years old, and he had lived alone in his small house at the edge of town for 6 of those years, ever since he had ridden down from Colorado and planted himself in Caldwell with no explanation and no history that he offered to anyone. He was the town's blacksmith. That much everyone knew. He kept the forge burning from early morning until late afternoon, shod horses, mended wagon wheels, repaired the iron hinges on the feed store doors, hammered out plowshares for the farmers who came in from the surrounding county. He did his work well, and he did it without complaint, and when the day was finished he walked home, cooked whatever simple thing he had, and sat on his porch watching the prairie dark settle over everything like a great, quiet blanket. He was not unkind. He greeted people when they greeted him. He paid his bills, and he caused no trouble. He had simply decided, somewhere along the line, that the world was a place that did not particularly require his participation beyond what was strictly necessary. The other men in Caldwell gathered at the Lone Star Saloon on Friday evenings. They played cards and drank whiskey and complained about their cattle or their crops or their wives, and they laughed the loud, comfortable laughter of men who belong somewhere. Harvey Wallace had been invited early on. He had gone twice, sat in the corner with a single glass of beer, and declined every subsequent invitation with a polite brevity that eventually trained people to stop asking. There had been a woman once, back in Colorado. Her name had been Clara, and she had been kind and pretty and deserving of far more than Harvey had known how to give her at 23 years old. He had been raw with grief then, still carrying the weight of his mother's death and his father's slow, bitter collapse into drink, and he had not known how to let Clara in through all of that armoring. She had eventually married the owner of a mining concern outside Denver, and Harvey had heard, through the uncertain channels of frontier gossip, that she was happy. He was glad of that. He was also glad that he had not dragged her into the gray, interior life he had subsequently built for himself. So that was Harvey Wallace as of October 1882, when the Bristol wagon rolled into Caldwell on a Thursday afternoon with a broken rear axle and a woman sitting up on the buckboard who looked as though she had not slept properly in 2 weeks. Pearl Bristol was 26 years old, and she had driven that wagon all the way from St. Louis, Missouri, which was either the bravest thing anyone had heard of or the most reckless, depending on who in Caldwell you asked. She was not particularly tall, but she carried herself with a directness that made her seem taller than she was. Her hair was the color of dark honey, worn pinned up beneath a practical wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. Her face was fine-featured and serious, with dark eyes that took in everything around her with a quality of attention that was almost disconcerting, as though she were quietly cataloging the world and making careful judgments about it. She wore a dark green traveling dress that was dusty from the road and a pair of boots that looked like they had been resoled at least once. She was, as Caldwell quickly learned, the new schoolteacher. The town had been without one for 14 months, ever since Miss Hollowell had taken ill and returned to her family in Ohio, and the school board had been writing letters to the State Board of Education, with increasing desperation for the better part of a year. Pearl Bristol had a teaching certificate from a normal school in Missouri, references from 2 different school boards that called her competent and dedicated, and the kind of practical, unfrightened bearing that suggested she had thought carefully about what she was doing and was prepared to do it. The broken axle brought her to Harvey's forge. He was working when she came in, the heat of the fire enormous in the small space, his hammer ringing against iron with a steady, purposeful rhythm. He did not hear her at first over the noise, and Pearl Bristol stood in the doorway of the smithy for a moment, watching him work with the particular frank attention she gave to everything before she raised her voice. "Excuse me," she said. "I was told you were the blacksmith." Harvey turned. The hammer paused mid-swing and he looked at her, and in the brief, unguarded second before he reassembled his usual careful expression, something shifted in his face. It was nothing dramatic. It was simply the look of a man who has been startled by something unexpected, though he could not have said in that moment precisely what the unexpected thing was. "I am," he said, setting the hammer down on the edge of the anvil. "My wagon has a broken rear axle," Pearl said, stepping forward into the forge with no particular hesitation about the heat or the noise or the fact that a strange, large man in a leather apron was looking at her with those storm-gray eyes. "It cracked about 2 miles east of town. I managed to limp it in, but I don't think I can go much further on it. Can you repair it?" Harvey wiped his hands on a cloth and came to the door to look at the wagon she had parked in the yard outside. He walked around it, crouched to look at the axle, pressed his thumb along the crack, and stood up. "I can repair it," he said. "Take me about a day and a half. I've got work ahead of you." "That's fine," Pearl said. "I'm not going anywhere until I get settled anyway. Is there lodging in town?" "Mrs. Hatch runs a boarding house on 2nd Street. Clean place, fair price." Pearl nodded, absorbing this information with the same methodical attention she gave everything. Then she looked at him for a moment with those dark eyes. "Thank you," she said. "I'm Pearl Bristol. I'm the new schoolteacher." "Harvey Wallace," he said, and that was as far as Harvey was concerned at the time that. But it was not that, of course. It never is. Pearl Bristol took a room at Mrs. Hatch's boarding house and spent the next 3 days getting oriented to Caldwell, meeting the school board, inspecting the schoolhouse, and introducing herself to the families whose children she would be teaching. She was organized and efficient, and she asked clear, sensible questions. The town took to her quickly, the way a town will when it has been hungry for something it did not quite know it was missing. Harvey repaired the axle in a day and 3/4, working with his usual quiet precision, and when Pearl came to collect the wagon and pay him, he gave her a price that was fair to the point of being almost too fair, and she looked at him again with that considering expression. "You're very good at this," she said, watching him demonstrate the repaired joint. "It's what I do," he said. "You must take some pride in it," she said, not as flattery but as a genuine observation. Harvey looked at her, slightly thrown by the directness of it. "I suppose I do," he said after a pause. "That's a good thing," Pearl said simply. "Not everyone can say the same." And she climbed up onto the buckboard, paid him, and drove the wagon around to the small house behind the schoolhouse that the town had provided for the teacher's residence. October became November. The plains turned the color of old gold, and the wind off the prairie sharpened to something with teeth in it. Caldwell was a cattle town, sitting just north of the Kansas-Indian Territory line, and the last of the season's cattle drives had come through in late September, leaving the town simultaneously quieter and more prosperous than it had been a month before. The streets were still busy with the commerce of a working frontier town, the mercantile and the feed store and the hotel and the saloon and the assier's office, but the particular electric quality of the cattle season had passed. Harvey noticed Pearl Bristol in the way that a man notices something he is trying not to notice, which is to say with a thoroughness that surprised and faintly irritated him. He saw her walking to the mercantile with a basket over her arm. He saw her standing outside the schoolhouse in the early morning, looking at something in a book while the children arrived around her. He saw her talking to old Doc Emery on the front porch of the doctor's office, her head tilted in that attentive way she had. She was always somewhere, always doing something purposeful, always moving through the world with that composed and serious energy. He told himself he was simply observing a new arrival to town, the way anyone does. He did not quite convince himself. The first real conversation they had, beyond the transaction of the axle repair, happened in the middle of November at Connolly's Mercantile. Harvey had come in for nails and lamp oil, which he needed, and for no other reason. Pearl was standing at the counter looking at a display of books that old Mr. Connolly had gotten in on the last supply wagon from Wichita. She was holding one carefully, reading the back, and when Harvey came to stand near the counter to wait his turn, she glanced up. "Do you read, Mr. Wallace?" she asked, not condescending, genuinely curious. "Some," he said. She held up the book. It was a collection of essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson. "Mr. Connolly charges too much for it," she said, "but I'm going to buy it anyway because I left my copy in Missouri and I've been missing it." Harvey looked at the book. His mother had owned a copy of Emerson's essays. He remembered the cover, the particular weight of it. "Self-reliance," he said, without quite meaning to. Pearl looked at him with a new interest. "That's the one," she said. "Have you read it?" "My mother had a copy," he said, "a long time ago." There was a pause, and Pearl seemed to understand that there was something complete and finished in that sentence, something she should not press. "It's a remarkable essay," she said instead. "I use parts of it in school sometimes. The older children are capable of more than people give them credit for." "I expect that's true," Harvey said. They said nothing more, but when he left the Mercantile with his nails and his lamp oil, Harvey found that the silence in his chest, the one he had carried so long it had become simply the natural state of things, had a small crack running through it. He was not sure what to make of that. November deepened. The first frost came hard and early, killing what remained of the kitchen gardens and driving the last warmth out of the prairie nights. Caldwell cinched itself down for winter the way a man cinches a coat, the people moving a little faster between buildings, the smoke from chimneys thickening, the conversations in the Mercantile and the hotel lobby acquiring the cozy, particular quality of voices sheltered from the cold. Pearl Bristol had, in the space of 6 weeks, become something essential to the town. She ran a tight, fair schoolroom. She had already identified which children were struggling and which were bored, and she had begun addressing both problems with a practical creativity that impressed even the most skeptical parents. She organized a small lending library from her own books, keeping them on a shelf in the schoolroom for anyone who wanted them. She attended church on Sundays without making a performance of it. She was liked. She was respected. She was also lonely, though she did not show it in a way that invited pity. Harvey recognized it the way one hollow thing recognizes another hollow thing, some quality in the way she sometimes stood looking at the prairie after the school day ended, the particular stillness that was not contentment but the practiced management of its absence. He learned things about her gradually, in the piecemeal way that small towns transmit information. She had grown up in St. Louis, the daughter of a schoolteacher father who had died of a fever when she was 17, leaving her and her mother with very little. Her mother had died 3 years after that. Pearl had finished her schooling on the strength of a charitable bursary and gotten her certificate and taken the first posting she was offered. She had no siblings. She had no one, really, waiting for her anywhere. She had come to Caldwell because Caldwell had needed her, and that, as far as Harvey could determine from the fragments of information that drifted his way, was enough for Pearl Bristol to build a life on. He found himself respecting her profoundly for that, and fearing her a little, because a woman who had that kind of quiet courage had a way of making the walls a person had built around themselves feel less like protection and more like cowardice. The direct encounter that changed things between them came on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, just before Thanksgiving. Harvey was walking back from delivering a repaired wagon wheel to the livery stable when he passed the schoolhouse and heard a sound that stopped him. It was crying, but not a child's crying. It was the careful, suppressed crying of an adult who believes themselves to be alone. He stood on the boardwalk, uncertain, then looked toward the schoolhouse door, which was slightly ajar. Through it he could see Pearl sitting at her desk, her hands over her face, her shoulders shaking with a grief that she was clearly doing her utmost to contain. The schoolroom was empty, the children long since gone home. Harvey Wallace stood there for a moment and thought about all the reasons to keep walking. He was a man who did not involve himself. He was a man who kept to his own counsel. He had spent 6 years carefully maintaining the idea that other people's pain was not his business, because engaging with it meant opening something in himself that he had spent considerable effort closing. He pushed open the schoolroom door and went inside. Pearl heard him and lifted her face immediately, the instinct to compose herself swift and fierce, and she was nearly successful. Her eyes were red and her jaw was tight with the effort of containment, and she looked at him with something that was equal parts embarrassment and wariness. "Mr. Wallace," she said, her voice only slightly unsteady. "I heard you," he said simply, because there was no point in pretending otherwise. He looked at her without any of the embarrassing pity that she was clearly braced for. "Are you hurt?" "No," she said. "No, I'm not hurt. I'm sorry, I'm not usually." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I received a letter today, from someone I knew in St. Louis. They wrote to tell me that the house I grew up in has been sold. I knew it had been sold. I had arranged for the sale myself before I left. I don't know why it should." She stopped again. Harvey stood in the middle of the schoolroom among the small desks and the maps pinned to the walls and the smell of chalk and wood smoke, and he said, "It's the last thing." She looked at him. "When everything is gone and someone sells the last thing," he said, "it lands different than you expected, even when you knew it was coming." Pearl Bristol looked at him for a long moment, and whatever she saw in his face told her that he was not speaking theoretically. Her expression shifted from composure to something more genuine and careful. "Yes," she said quietly, "that's exactly what it is." They were silent for a moment. It was not an uncomfortable silence. "Will you be all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and she meant it. "I always am. Thank you, Mr. Wallace." Harvey nodded and left and walked home in the early winter dark and sat on his porch in the cold until the stars came out, thinking about how easy it had been to say that true thing to her, and how long it had been since he had said anything true to anyone at all. He had understood her grief because he had lived its mirror image. His father had sold the family farm in Ohio when Harvey was 20, and Harvey had signed the papers from a distance, not even going back for it, telling himself he was past caring. He had not been past caring. He had simply been past knowing how to care openly, which was a different thing entirely. Thanksgiving came and went. The holiday had an unofficial quality on the frontier, observed more by some than others, and Harvey spent it as he spent every holiday, alone, eating something simple, going to bed early. He was used to this. He had been alone through Christmas, through New Year, through birthdays unmarked even by himself, through every ordinary and extraordinary day for 6 years. Solitude had long since ceased to feel like deprivation and had become simply the texture of his existence. But this Thanksgiving, for the first time, he was aware of it. He could hear, distantly, the sounds of families gathered at the hotel, where Mrs. Delgado put on a meal, and the sound seemed to have a new quality to it, like a word in a foreign language you have finally learned the meaning of. He thought about Pearl Bristol. He wondered if she had been invited somewhere. He thought she probably had been, because Caldwell was the kind of town that looked after its own, and Pearl had become their own quickly. He hoped she had. She had. He learned later from Mrs. Hatch, with whom she still took some meals, that Pearl had spent Thanksgiving with the Garrison family, whose 3 children were students of hers, and that she had brought a sweet potato pie that she had baked herself in the small oven at the teacher's house, and that everyone had found it excellent. Harvey thought about her bringing a pie to someone else's table, and felt something he firmly told himself was not longing. December arrived in earnest, bringing with it a quality of cold that was particular to the Kansas plains, a penetrating, relentless cold that found every gap in every wall and made the nights feel like something to be survived rather than simply experienced. The town of Caldwell dressed itself in what modest Christmas spirit the frontier allowed, a wreath on the door of the mercantile, pine boughs on the hotel's front desk, a hand-lettered sign in the window of the bakery advertising Christmas cakes. Harvey replaced the worn hinge on the schoolhouse door, which he had noticed was sticking, leaving the children in the cold longer than necessary each morning while Pearl wrestled with it. He did this one afternoon when school was out, and he did not mention it to Pearl, and when she noticed the next morning she would have had no way to know who had done it, except that she knew. She came to the forge that afternoon to thank him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "The children were standing in the cold," he said, not looking up from the work in his hands. "Still," she said, "it was kind." He looked up then briefly, and Pearl was looking at him with that direct, considering gaze of hers, and there was something in it that was different from her usual assessment, something warmer and more personal, and Harvey felt the back of his neck go hot in a way he had not felt since he was considerably younger. "How are you finding the winter?" he asked, which was not what he had meant to say but was the first thing that came out. "Cold," Pearl said and smiled. It was the first time Harvey had seen her smile fully, not the polite professional smile she gave parents and school board members, but a real one, quick and warm, and it did something extraordinary to her face and something equally extraordinary to Harvey's chest. "You get used to it," he said. "Everyone keeps telling me that," she said. "I'm choosing to believe them." She paused. "Mrs. Garrison has invited me to a Christmas gathering she's putting together. She mentioned that she was going to invite you as well." Harvey picked up his hammer. "I don't usually go to those things." "Why not?" Pearl asked, not challenging, genuinely curious the way she was about everything. Harvey thought about it. He had a dozen reasons, all of them well rehearsed, and he looked at them lined up in his mind and found them suddenly insufficient in ways they had not been insufficient before. "Habit mostly," he said honestly. Pearl tilted her head slightly. "Habits can be changed," she said, "if they're not serving you." She smiled again, briefly, and left, and Harvey stood at his anvil holding his hammer and feeling as though something had shifted in the foundation of everything he thought he knew about himself. He went to the Garrison Christmas gathering. He told himself it was because Mrs. Garrison had specifically asked him twice, and it would have been rude to refuse, which was true but was not the reason. He wore his good shirt and his best coat, and he arrived exactly when he said he would, because Harvey Wallace, whatever else he was never late. Pearl was already there, standing near the fireplace with Mrs. Garrison and two other women, and when he came in she looked across the room and their eyes met, and she gave him a small, genuine smile of recognition that felt like being given something he had not known he wanted. It was not a dramatic evening. It was a simple frontier Christmas gathering. Good people crowded into a warm parlor, children running between the adults' legs, the smell of pine and wood smoke, and the hot spiced cider that Mrs. Garrison ladled out from a pot on the fire. There was music, a fiddle played by Tom Garrison that was enthusiastic if not always accurate, and some singing, and a great deal of the comfortable, easy talk of neighbors who know each other well. Harvey spoke more that evening than he had spoken at any social occasion in 6 years. Pearl moved through the gathering with her usual composed friendliness, but she found her way back to him several times over the course of the evening, and each time the conversation between them went somewhere real and interesting. She told him about the school she had attended in Missouri, and the teacher who had inspired her, a fierce old woman named Miss Aldrich who had believed that education was the most powerful force available to ordinary people and had run her schoolroom accordingly. Harvey told her about his apprenticeship with the blacksmith in the town outside Columbus where he had grown up, an old German man named Bauer who had taught him that every piece of iron had a nature, and that the smith's job was to find it and work with it rather than against it. "That's a beautiful way to think about it," Pearl said. "He was a good teacher," Harvey said. They looked at each other for a moment across the small shared, understanding that good teaching, whatever form it took, was among the more valuable things in the world. "What brought you to Caldwell?" Pearl asked. Harvey considered his usual answer, which was brief and deflective, and found that he did not want to give it to her. "I needed somewhere that didn't know me," he said instead. "Somewhere I could start from nothing." Pearl nodded slowly, not pressing, but her expression said that she understood that too, more than most people would. "And did it work?" she asked quietly. "It made a life," Harvey said. "I'm not sure if that's the same thing." She looked at him with those dark eyes, serious and warm at the same time. "I think it might be the beginning of the same thing," she said. And then Tom Garrison launched into a particularly ambitious rendition of a Christmas hymn on his fiddle, and the moment passed into the general festivity of the evening. Harvey walked Pearl back to the teacher's house that night through the cold and the dark, because it was the decent thing to do, and also because he wanted to. They walked in easy silence mostly, their breath clouding in the frozen air, the town quiet around them. At the gate of the small house, Pearl turned and looked up at him. "I'm glad you came," she said. "I think it was good for you." "I think so too," Harvey said, and he was surprised by how completely he meant it. "Good night, Mr. Wallace." "Good night, Miss Bristol." She went inside, and Harvey walked home through the cold, and the hollow silence in his chest was smaller than it had been in a very long time. The days that followed had a different quality to them. Harvey found reasons to be in parts of town where he might encounter Pearl, which was not hard, because Pearl was everywhere. He brought a repaired school desk back to the schoolhouse himself, rather than sending the Connolly boy with it. He took a slightly longer route home that happened to pass the teacher's house. He was not proud of these small maneuverings, but he was also unable to stop them. Pearl, for her part, found reasons to pass the forge. She claimed she needed to ask about having a hook repaired, which was true, but any woman who could drive a wagon alone from St. Louis to Kansas could have repaired the hook herself. Harvey repaired it, and they talked for 20 minutes about the weather and the school board's plans for expanding the schoolroom, and whether the Emerson essay on friendship was a better piece of writing than the one on self-reliance. And Harvey said he thought they were each necessary, and Pearl said that was a very diplomatic answer, and he laughed. He laughed out loud at that, and it surprised both of them. It was the first time Pearl had heard him laugh. She looked at him for a moment after the sound of it had faded, and something in her expression was very careful and very intent, and then she looked away at the repaired hook in her hand. "You should do that more often," she said quietly. "Do what?" he asked. "Laugh," she said, simply, not looking up. Harvey held very still for a moment, the way an animal holds still when something approaches that might be a threat and might be something else entirely. Then he said, "I haven't had much occasion to." Pearl looked up at him. "You do now," she said. And then she thanked him and left, and Harvey stood in his forge for a long time after, the fire burning low behind him, with the remarkable sensation of being seen by someone with such clarity that it felt simultaneously like exposure and like relief. He knew, by this point, that he was in considerable trouble. He had spent 6 years being unreachable, and here was Pearl Bristol reaching him with nothing more than her frank attention and her honest eyes, and the way she said true things simply, as though the truth did not require dressing up or protecting anyone from it. He was not entirely sure what to do with that. He talked to no one about it, naturally, because Harvey Wallace did not talk to anyone about personal things, but the situation was not entirely invisible to the small, watchful world of Caldwell. Mrs. Hatch mentioned to Mrs. Garrison that she had noticed Harvey Wallace passing the schoolhouse an unusual number of times. Tom Garrison mentioned to the men at the saloon that Harvey had been sociable at the Christmas gathering in a way that was frankly out of character. Doc Emery, who was observant in the way that doctors are, watched Harvey's face, The next time Harvey came to have a cut on his hand tended, and thought he understood something that Harvey himself was still working through. Pearl, for her part, was doing her own working through. She had come to Caldwell for a purpose, and the purpose was simple and practical, and it had not included falling for the quiet, solitary blacksmith with the storm-gray eyes who had once said the exact right thing about the last thing being sold, and had never even realized what he had given her in that moment. She was a practical woman. She had been practical all her life, out of necessity, because practicality was what had kept her upright through the loss of her father, the loss of her mother, the long years of making her own way in a world that offered women like her very little room for error. But there was something about Harvey Wallace that undid her practicality in a way she had not anticipated and could not quite manage. It was not his looks, though he was certainly a striking man. It was something more essential than that. It was the quality of his attention when he listened to her, the sense that every word she said was being taken seriously and considered honestly. It was the way he had walked into the schoolroom when she was crying and said the one true thing without making her feel weak for needing it. It was the way he looked at the world, quietly and carefully, as though he was trying to do right by it even when he had not quite figured out how. She also recognized his solitude for what it was, because she had carried her own version of it. She knew the difference between a person who was alone because they wanted to be, and a person who was alone because they had not yet found the thing that made them want to be otherwise. The week before Christmas was the last week of school before the winter break, and Pearl had organized a small Christmas performance for the children, singing and recitation, and a brief play that she had written herself about a family of settlers arriving at their new home, which several of the parents thought was quite pointed, and several others simply thought was charming. She had been working on it for weeks, staying late at the schoolhouse by lamplight to help the children rehearse, and Harvey had walked past on more than one of those evenings and seen the warm yellow light in the schoolhouse windows and the sound of children's voices and Pearl's clear, patient instructions floating out into the cold night air. On the evening of the performance, Harvey went. He told himself it was because several of his customers were the children's parents and it would be impolite not to. This was, at this point, such a transparent piece of self-deception that he did not even bother finishing the thought. He sat in the back of the schoolroom with the other adults and watched the children perform, and the children were genuinely touching, earnest and effortful and sweet, and Pearl stood to the side with a quiet, radiant pride in them that was one of the most beautiful things Harvey had ever seen. She was not proud of herself. She was proud of them. She had brought out something in these children, some confidence and capability, and she was moved by it in a way she was not trying to hide, and in not hiding it, she was more honest than anyone Harvey had encountered in a long time. After the performance, people crowded forward to congratulate the children and thank Pearl, and Harvey stood back and waited, and when the crowd had thinned he approached. "They did well," he said. Pearl looked up at him with those glowing eyes still warm from the performance. "They were wonderful," she said, "every one of them." "You made them wonderful," he said, and watched surprise and something more complicated cross her face, because that was a more personal and more direct thing than he had ever said to her before. "That's a kind thing to say," she said carefully. "It's a true thing," he said. And because he was Harvey Wallace and he had spent 34 years saying too little, and this felt suddenly like a moment he should not let pass without saying at least something real, he said, "I want to ask you something." Pearl waited, her expression attentive and still. "Would you walk with me?" he asked. "On Sunday, along the creek if the weather holds." He watched her face. She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment Harvey felt the full weight of what it cost him to ask, because he had not asked anything like this of anyone in a very long time, and the possibility of no was enormous. "I would like that," Pearl said. And she meant it, Harvey could tell, in the same way he was learning to read her meaning, which was that she said what she meant, and she meant what she said. They walked on Sunday along Bluff Creek south of town. The winter prairie spread out around them in its beautiful, austere way, the grass pale and stiff, the sky a low, textured gray that made the red of the creek bank sing against it. They walked for 2 hours and talked about almost everything, their conversation moving the way good conversation does, freely and associatively, from the history of Kansas to the methods of teaching reading to the relative merits of different approaches to iron work to the question of what people needed in order to live well, which was the kind of conversation Harvey had not had since he was young, and had still believed that the world was a place he could engage with fully. He learned things about Pearl that the fragments of town gossip had not given him. He learned that she had taught herself French from a book, because she was determined to read certain things in their original language. He learned that she had a specific and well-reasoned view about how children should be taught mathematics that was somewhat at odds with the prevailing approach, but that she had found consistently more effective. He learned that she had been frightened, genuinely frightened, making this journey alone, and had done it anyway, and that the doing it anyway was something she considered the most important skill she had. He told her things he had not told anyone in Caldwell. He told her about Colorado, not all of it but some of it. He told her about his father, about the drinking and the bitterness, and the way a man could be swallowed by grief until there was nothing left of what he had been. He told her that he had spent years being angry at his father and then spent other years understanding him, and that neither the anger nor the understanding had been quite enough, but that together they had eventually added up to something like peace with it. Pearl listened to all of this with the particular quality of attention she had, and she did not offer easy comfort or hollow reassurance. She said, "That must have been very hard to watch." "It was," Harvey said, "and very hard to leave." "That too," he said, "though I told myself it wasn't." She looked at him. "You seem to have a talent for telling yourself useful things," she said, not cruelly, with a quiet accuracy that made him stop walking briefly. "I suppose I have," he said. "It got me through." "And now?" she asked. Harvey looked out at the winter creek and the pale grass and the wide, gray sky world. "Now I'm less certain it's still what I need," he said. Pearl looked at him for a long moment, her hat brim turned toward him, her dark eyes serious. "Good," she said simply. They walked back to town in the late afternoon as the light went amber and the cold deepened, and at the corner where their ways parted she turned to him and said, "Thank you for asking me. I needed that." "So did I," he said, and it was the most honest thing he had said in 6 years, and it felt like taking a deep breath after a long time underwater. Christmas was 4 days away. Harvey went home that evening and sat by his fire, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, the solitude did not feel like something he had chosen. It felt like something he was wearing out of habit, like a coat that had long since stopped fitting. He thought about Pearl Bristol bringing a sweet potato pie to the garrison table for Thanksgiving. He thought about her standing at the schoolhouse door in the early morning, watching her students arrive. He thought about the way she had smiled at him, that first full smile, quick and warm, and the way she had said, "You do now." He wanted to give her something for Christmas. He had never given anyone a Christmas gift in a very long time, and the wanting was unfamiliar and slightly terrifying, but also undeniably alive. He spent 2 days in the forge, after his regular work was done, working on something that was not a commission but his own idea. It was a bookend, a single iron bookend in the shape of a small, intricately detailed open book, the pages suggested by thin, overlapping layers of iron hammered into a convincing ripple. It was the most delicate work he had done in years, the kind of thing that required care and patience and a willingness to let the iron find its own nature, as old Bauer had taught him. He worked on it in the evenings, his lamp burning late, and when it was finished he looked at it for a long time and thought it was good. Not because of the craft, though the craft was good, but because it said something honest about what he thought of her. He wrapped it in a square of plain cloth and he held onto it and was not sure how to give it to her, because Harvey Wallace, for all his qualities, had very little experience with giving gifts to people he cared about, and the carrying was recent and enormous and not entirely comfortable. Christmas Eve came. Caldwell observed it quietly. Most families gathered in their own homes, the church holding a candlelight service that a good portion of the town attended. Harvey went to the service, which he had not done in years, sitting in the back with his hat in his hands while the candlelight moved over the pine boughs and the plain, earnest faces of his neighbors, and the pastor read about a child born in a stable and the improbable hope that attended that arrival. He saw Pearl across the church, sitting with the Garrison family. She wore a dark blue dress he had not seen before, and her hair was differently arranged, softer than usual, and she was listening to the service with her characteristic full attention, her face serious and lit by candlelight and very beautiful. She glanced across the church at some point during the second hymn and found him looking at her, and she did not look away immediately. They looked at each other for a moment in the candlelight, and then both looked back toward the front of the church, and Harvey's heart was doing something loud and ungainly that he chose not to examine too closely. After the service, the congregation milled about outside in the cold, speaking to each other in the relaxed, warm way of people who have shared something. Harvey intended to speak to Pearl, but she was surrounded by the Garrison children, who seemed to regard her with an adoring energy that kept her occupied, and Harvey stood a little apart, and after a while he put on his hat and walked home. He left the wrapped bookend on his workbench and went to bed and lay awake for a while, listening to the wind off the prairie and thinking about things he had not thought about in a long time. He was asleep before midnight. He woke before dawn on Christmas morning, the way he always did, because the body has its habits, and his body woke at 5 in the morning regardless of the day. The house was cold, the fire having burned down in the night, and he dressed quickly and went to the kitchen to stoke it and put water on for coffee. It was then that he saw it. His kitchen window faced east, toward the edge of town and the open prairie beyond, and on the wide sill of that window, set carefully and precisely, was a plate covered with a cloth. He stood very still for a moment, looking at it. Then he went to the window and lifted the cloth. On the plate was a careful arrangement of Christmas food. There were 2 slices of pound cake, clearly made from scratch. There were 3 molasses cookies shaped like stars. There was a small, folded piece of paper tucked under the edge of the cake. Harvey picked up the note with hands that were not entirely steady and unfolded it. The handwriting was Pearl's, which he recognized from the time she had written out receipts and notices for school events. It said, "No one should be alone on Christmas morning. Merry Christmas, Harvey. From Pearl." He sat down at his kitchen table, which he had not meant to do. He sat down, and he looked at the plate and the cloth and the careful arrangement of things she had made herself and brought to his windowsill in the dark before dawn on Christmas morning. And he understood that she had done this quietly, without expectation, not to make a declaration, but simply because she had seen him, really seen him, and understood that there was a loneliness in him that had been going unaddressed for a very long time, and she had done the small, enormous thing of addressing it. Harvey Wallace, who had not cried since he was 22 years old at his mother's grave, sat at his kitchen table on Christmas morning and pressed his fingers over his eyes for a moment and breathed. No one had ever done anything like that for him, not in the 34 years of his life, not once. He ate the cake and the cookies slowly, with his coffee, watching the Christmas dawn come up over the prairie, the sky going from black to gray to a pale, almost luminous gold, and he felt something he had not felt in so long he had nearly forgotten the word for it. He felt grateful to be alive and present in the world. He waited until he judged it a decent hour, when the pale gold light had spread properly, and the town had begun to stir, and then he put on his coat and picked up the cloth-wrapped bookend from the workbench and walked to the teacher's house behind the schoolhouse. Pearl answered his knock in a different dress than the Christmas Eve blue, a warm wool dress in dark red, and her hair was down, which he had never seen, loose around her shoulders in dark honey waves, and she looked slightly surprised to find him at her door, but not, he noticed, displeased. "Mr. Wallace," she said. "Harvey," he said, "please." A pause, the smallest smile. "Harvey," she said. "You left a plate on my windowsill," he said. Pearl looked at him steadily. "I did," she said. "There was no apology in it and no coyness, just acknowledgement. No one has ever done that," he said. "For me, nothing like that." Pearl's expression shifted just slightly to something softer and more careful. "I know," she said quietly. "I could tell." He held out the cloth-wrapped package. "I made you something," he said, "for Christmas. I wasn't sure how to give it to you, so I was going to wait, but now seems like the right time." Pearl took the package and unwrapped it there in the doorway, and when she saw the iron bookend, she went very still. She turned it over in her hand slowly, studying the hammered pages, the precise and patient detail of it, the small carved curve of the spine. "Harvey," she said, and her voice was different. "You made this?" "Yes." "It's extraordinary," she said, looking up at him with eyes that were, he was almost certain, brighter than usual. "It's the most beautiful piece of ironwork I've ever seen." "You had a book in your hands every time I saw you," he said. "It seemed right." Pearl looked at him for a long moment, standing in her doorway on Christmas morning with the cold air around them and the bookend in her hands, and then she said, "Will you come in? I have coffee and there's more pound cake." He came in. They sat at her small kitchen table and drank coffee and ate pound cake and talked for 3 hours, and at some point during those 3 hours, the last of the careful distance between them dissolved entirely, and what was left was simply two people who had been alone for a long time and had found each other, which was the best and most uncomplicated of all possible things. He told her about Clara, briefly and honestly, and Pearl listened without jealousy or judgment. She told him about a young man in Missouri named Robert who had courted her for a year, and then decided that a schoolteacher wife was more trouble than she was worth, and Harvey felt a brief, unreasonable desire to find this Robert and discuss the matter with him, which he kept to himself. Pearl set the bookend on her small bookshelf between 2 volumes of history and stepped back to look at it. "It belongs there," she said, "and so do you." Harvey looked at her. They were standing very close together, the winter light coming through the window, the coffee still warm on the table behind them. "Pearl," he said. "Yes," she said, and she said it before he had asked anything, and they both understood what she meant by it. He took her hand, which was warm and small in his large, calloused grip, and she turned her fingers through his and held on, and they stood like that for a moment in the winter light. It was, Harvey thought later, the best Christmas he had ever had, which was not a particularly difficult achievement given what his previous Christmases had looked like, but which also happened to be entirely true. He kissed her that afternoon, standing on her front porch in the cold, at the end of the 3 hours that had turned into 4. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was a quiet, certain, unhurried kiss, the kind that comes when two people have already done all the necessary deciding, and the kiss is only the outward expression of an inward fact. Pearl's hand came up to his face and rested there, warm against the cold of his jaw, and when they separated she looked at him with her dark eyes very clear and very direct and said, "I was hoping you would do that." "Were you?" he said. "Since the walk along the creek," she said. Harvey laughed, and it was the full laugh again, the one she had told him to use more often, and Pearl smiled the full genuine smile, and the cold winter air around them was full of their breath and their happiness, which was uncomplicated and real and entirely deserved. The weeks that followed Christmas were the happiest Harvey could remember in his adult life, which was a large thing to say, and which he understood to be true without inflation. He and Pearl moved into a new kind of proximity that was different from the cautious circling of the autumn. They had Sunday dinners together, alternating between his house and hers. He walked her home from the church on the evenings she volunteered to help organize the Ladies' Society charitable activities. She came by the forge, sometimes simply to talk, leaning against the doorframe with her arms folded, watching him work and continuing whatever conversation they had been having earlier in the day, as though the conversation were a thread they could pick up and put down and always find again. She challenged him, constantly, in the way that intelligent, honest people challenge each other. She argued with him about politics, which were complicated in 1882 Kansas in ways that Harvey had mostly tried not to think about. She pressed him on things he had let himself be lazy about. She refused to let him retreat into the easy deflection of silence when she asked him a direct question, and he discovered, to his genuine surprise, that being challenged by her was not uncomfortable. It was the opposite of uncomfortable. It was like being asked to be more fully himself, and that invitation, coming from someone whose opinion he respected more than almost anyone's, turned out to be something he had been quietly wanting for a very long time. Caldwell observed all of this with the transparent interest that small towns bring to the romantic developments of their members, which is to say that everyone knew everything almost immediately and had opinions about it. And the opinions were, for the most part, warmly positive because both Harvey and Pearl were well regarded, and the consensus was that they were good for each other, which was also true. Mrs. Hatch told Mrs. Garrison that Pearl had practically been glowing all of January. Tom Garrison told the men at the saloon that Harvey Wallace had been seen smiling on a regular basis, which was sufficiently remarkable to constitute news. January became February, cold and relentless, and Harvey built up the fire at his forge earlier in the mornings so that the smithy was warm when Pearl walked past on her way to the schoolhouse and stuck her head in to say good morning, which she did most days now. He always had coffee ready, and she always had time for 5 minutes of it, and those 5 morning minutes became one of the things he counted on, one of the things that made the structure of his days feel different, populated and warm and pointed towards something. In February, something happened that shook the comfortable new world they had been building. A man came to town looking for trouble. His name was Deke Harmon, and he was one of the remnants of a cattle operation that had collapsed badly, leaving a number of men without pay and with considerable resentment. Harmon was not a dangerous man in the way that frontier legends were made of. He was simply a man who drank too much and had a bad temper and an overinflated sense of what he was owed by the world. He arrived in Caldwell on a Thursday in February, and he made himself unpleasant at the saloon, and he got into an argument with the livery stable owner about a horse. And when Harvey came down to the livery stable to deliver some repairs, Harmon, who was looking for a grievance, decided to take exception to Harvey's presence and his manner, and apparently his face. The things he said were not worth repeating, the kind of mean-spirited nonsense that drunk men say when they are trying to prove something to themselves. Harvey, who had not started a fight in 12 years and had no intention of starting one now, was brief and flat in his responses, the kind of responses that were not designed to inflame and were also not backing down, because Harvey Wallace was not a man who backed down. Harmon shoved him. Harvey stepped back, steadied himself, and looked at the man with calm gray eyes. "Go sleep it off," he said. The livery owner, a capable man named Briggs, was already sending his boy for the town marshal. The town marshal, a capable and fair-minded man named Garrett who had been doing his job quietly and effectively for 4 years, arrived in short order and removed Harmon from the situation. Harmon spent the night in the jail and was quietly escorted to the edge of town the following morning with the recommendation that he not return. Harvey went home with a bruised shoulder from the shove and thought nothing more of it. Pearl, however, heard about it from Mrs. Garrison by the following morning, and she appeared at the forge at her usual time the next day, and instead of leaning in the doorframe she came all the way in, and she looked at his shoulder with a direct attention that was both medical and something more personal. "Are you hurt?" she asked, which was exactly what he had asked her in the schoolroom in November, and the symmetry of it was not lost on either of them. "Shoulder," he said. "Nothing. Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Pearl looked at him for a moment, and her expression was complicated in a way he had not quite seen on her face before. "I don't want anything to happen to you," she said quietly, which was a larger and more honest thing than either of them might have expected her to say at 8 o'clock on a Friday morning. Harvey set down what he was holding. "Nothing happened," he said. "This time," she said. He looked at her. "Pearl." "I know," she said. I know it's the frontier and men have disputes and you handled yourself well and there's nothing to be done about it. I know all of that." She paused. She stopped and pressed her lips together, and Harvey understood that what she was having difficulty saying was that she was invested in his continued existence in a way that had caught her somewhat off guard. "I know," he said, because she knew that he knew, and she knew that he felt the same way about her, and saying more than that in the 8 o'clock light of a cold February morning seemed like more than either of them needed. She picked up her coffee cup and held it in both hands. "Good," she said. The single word covered enormous ground. Spring came slowly to the Kansas plains, reluctantly and in pieces, patches of warmth interrupted by late cold snaps, the first green appearing in the creek bottoms in March while the high ground was still frozen. Harvey had been watching the prairie come back to life for 6 years and had always found it interesting in an abstract way, but this spring it was something else. This spring he noticed it the way a person notices things they want to share, which meant he was already, without having formalized anything, sharing it with Pearl, turning things over in his mind, and thinking about how she would see them. He proposed in April on a Sunday at the creek. He had been thinking about it for 2 months. He was not a man who moved impulsively in important matters, and he had done the thinking carefully and honestly, not looking for reasons to proceed, but simply testing the idea against everything he knew about himself and about Pearl, and about what a life together would actually look like, day to day, in a small frontier town in Kansas, where both of them would continue to be exactly who they were. Everything he knew said yes. Every angle of the question resolved to the same answer. He wanted to be with her. He wanted to spend his Sundays and his mornings and his evenings and his ordinary Tuesdays with Pearl Bristol, who challenged him and saw him and made him laugh, and had left a plate on his windowsill Christmas morning without expecting anything in return, which was still, in his private accounting, the most remarkable thing anyone had ever done for him. He did not make a ceremony of it. He was not by nature a ceremonial man, and Pearl was not by nature a woman who required ceremony. He waited until they had walked far enough from town that they were alone with the spring prairie, the yellow-green grass coming up around them and the meadowlarks making their noise in the willows along the creek, and he stopped walking and turned to her. "Pearl," he said. She looked at him. She seemed to know something was coming. She had that still, attentive quality about her. "I know what I was before you came here," he said. "I was managing. That's all it was. Managing and telling myself that was enough." He looked at her directly, the way she had always looked at him. "It wasn't enough. You're what enough looks like, and I'd like to spend the rest of my life finding out what that means." Pearl looked at him for a long moment with those dark, clear eyes. "Is that a proposal, Harvey Wallace?" she asked. "It is," he said. "It's the least graceful proposal in the history of Kansas, but it is one." Pearl laughed, and then, very suddenly, her eyes were bright with tears that she blinked back with characteristic determination. "It is not the least graceful," she said. "It is the most honest one I can imagine, and yes," she stepped forward and put her hand on his chest, right over his heart. "Yes." He put his arms around her and she leaned into him, and the spring prairie was noisy with birds, and the creek was high with snowmelt, and the sky overhead was the particular blue of a Kansas April that Harvey would remember for the rest of his life. They were married in June, in the small white church in Caldwell, with most of the town in attendance, because most of the town wanted to be. Pearl wore a dress of pale ivory that Mrs. Hatch had helped her make, and her hair was up with small white flowers woven through it, and she walked down the aisle of the church with the same straight-backed, clear-eyed directness with which she did everything. And Harvey stood at the altar in his good suit and watched her come toward him and felt something so large and simple that it had no name, or rather had the oldest name: love. The pastor read the service, and Harvey and Pearl made their vows to each other in clear, steady voices, and when they were pronounced married and Harvey kissed his wife for the first time as her husband, the assembled Caldwell community, who had a great deal invested emotionally in this outcome, responded with an enthusiasm that was entirely gratifying. Mrs. Garrison cried. Tom Garrison pretended not to be moved and was visibly moved. Doc Emery looked on with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has correctly diagnosed something important. Mrs. Hatch dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief and told anyone who would listen that she had known from the beginning. The celebration afterward was the most genuinely joyful event Harvey could remember being part of. Tables had been set up outside the church in the warm June evening, and there was food enough to stagger a cattle drive, and Tom Garrison's fiddle was joined by two others, and there was dancing, real dancing, the kind Harvey had not done since he was young and had not known he missed. He danced with Pearl. He was not a graceful dancer, and he told her so honestly on the floor, and she told him that was all right because she was going to lead, which she did. And they danced in the summer evening with the lanterns burning and the fiddles playing and the warm Kansas night around them. And Harvey thought that if he had told himself 10 years ago, or even 1 year ago, that this was what was waiting for him, he would not have believed it. He would have called it too much to hope for. He was glad he had been wrong about that. Pearl moved into Harvey's house after the wedding. She had always found it large for a single person, she said, standing in the middle of the main room and looking around with an assessing eye, and she was right. He had rattled around in it for 6 years, but with her there it was different. She brought her books and her practical household organization, and her particular habit of having fresh flowers on the table whenever the season allowed it, and the house that had been simply functional became something else, something that had a life to it. He built her a proper bookshelf, wide and solid, because the small shelf she had in the teacher's house had been inadequate for her actual library. He built it from good oak and fitted the back smooth and planed the shelves level, and Pearl arranged her books on it with the care of someone arranging something precious. And the iron bookend he had made for her Christmas held one end in place, and Harvey stood in the room looking at it and felt a satisfaction so complete it was almost physical. She kept teaching. This had been a matter of some discussion with the school board, because the convention in 1882 was that married women did not continue in teaching positions, and the board had initially raised the question with some discomfort. Pearl had addressed this with the school board directly, clearly, and without heat, presenting the argument that Caldwell had been without a teacher for 14 months before her arrival, and that her marital status had no bearing whatsoever on her ability to teach the children of the town effectively, and that if the board wished to return to a state of educational deficiency in the name of convention, she wished them good fortune finding her replacement. Harvey, when she told him this, said, "What did they say?" "They agreed with me," Pearl said, with the particular satisfaction of a person who expected to be agreed with and was correct. "Mostly because Mr. Connolly's youngest daughter is in my class and is doing better than she has in years, and Mr. Connolly made his opinion known." Harvey smiled at her. "Did they have any choice?" "Very little," Pearl said serenely. And she went back to school the following Monday and continued to educate the children of Caldwell with the same purposeful excellence she had been bringing to it all along. The summer of 1882 became the autumn of 1882, became the winter of 1882, and Harvey marked the seasons differently now. He marked them in relation to Pearl, in the growing familiarity of living with someone, the morning rituals and the evening conversations and the shared management of a household and the occasional disagreement, and the process of repairing the occasional disagreement, which they did as they did most things, directly and honestly, and with a willingness to hear what the other person was actually saying. They were not a fairy tale couple. They were two real people, both of them shaped by difficulty and loss and the long experience of managing alone. And there were things in both of them that needed working out, habits of self-sufficiency that sometimes looked like walls, tendencies toward silence when speaking would have been more useful. Harvey still sometimes retreated into himself when things felt overwhelming, going very quiet in a way that Pearl had learned to recognize, and to gently, consistently refused to accept as the end of the conversation. Pearl still sometimes handled too much alone, not from distrust, but from the deep habit of being the only person responsible for her own existence. And Harvey had learned to pay attention to when she was doing this, and to simply stand beside her and say, "I'm here," which was the thing she most needed to hear. They got better at each other, which is the best thing that can be said of any two people in a marriage. The first Christmas they spent together, Harvey woke before Pearl on Christmas morning, as was his habit, and built up the fire. And when Pearl came into the kitchen in her wrapper, he had coffee ready and a plate of the molasses cookies she had been making the night before. And they sat at the kitchen table together in the quiet of the Christmas dawn and drank their coffee and looked at each other across the table, and both of them, without speaking, were thinking about the year before. About the cold windowsill and the wrapped plate and the beginning of everything. "What are you thinking?" Pearl asked. "About last Christmas," Harvey said. "About the plate." Pearl wrapped both hands around her cup. "I almost didn't do it," she said. "I stood outside your house for 5 minutes in the cold arguing with myself." Harvey looked at her. "What made you do it?" Pearl considered. "I thought about you going through the whole day alone," she said quietly. "Sitting at that table by yourself on Christmas morning with nothing that anyone had given you or made for you or thought of you for, and I couldn't leave that." She paused. "I've been alone on Christmas. I know what it feels like. And I couldn't leave it there." Harvey reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "You changed everything," he said. "That morning, you changed everything." Pearl turned her hand under his and held it. "I know," she said. "So did you, when you came into the schoolroom." They sat there in the Christmas morning quiet, holding hands across the kitchen table, with the fire going and the coffee warm and the first light beginning to edge the windows, and the life they had built together sitting around them in every small and particular detail. The books on the shelf and the iron bookend and the flowers dried from the autumn and the good solid furniture and the smell of wood smoke and coffee and home. In the spring of 1883, Pearl told Harvey she was expecting a child. He was at the forge when she told him, because she had come in the way she always did, in the late afternoon when he was finishing up, and she had stood in the doorway for a moment looking at him with an expression he could not immediately read, which was unusual because he had become very good at reading her expressions. "What is it?" he said. Pearl came in out of the doorway and stood in front of him and said, "We're going to have a child." Harvey was very still for a moment. Then he sat down on the workbench, which was inelegant, and Pearl looked at him with both concern and the beginning of a smile. "Are you all right?" she said. He stopped. He looked up at her, this woman who had come into his life on a broken wagon and fixed everything broken in him, and he said, "I'm Pearl, I'm very happy." He laughed, and it was the full laugh, the one she had told him to use more often, and Pearl's smile broke fully open. "Good," she said, "because I am too." He stood and put his arms around her and held her carefully, and she rested her head against his shoulder, and they stood in the warm, smoky air of the forge, the late afternoon sun coming through the door, holding what was coming toward them. The child was born in December of 1883, which was either a remarkable coincidence or a meaningful one, depending on how you looked at it. He was born on the 19th of December, 6 days before Christmas, during a snowstorm that kept Doc Emery at the house for most of the night, and kept Harvey in a state of barely managed anxiety that Pearl, from the bedroom, addressed periodically by calling out that everything was proceeding normally and that he should stop wearing out the floorboards. He was a boy. He weighed 7 pounds and he was red-faced and furious about being born, which Harvey found completely relatable. He had a remarkable quantity of dark hair and his mother's dark eyes, and from the first moment Harvey held him, which was within 20 minutes of his arrival, Harvey understood something he had not quite understood before, which was that his capacity for this, for love, for the full and undefended kind of love, had simply been waiting for the right conditions to exist in. He had believed himself to be not built for it, to be the kind of man who managed and endured rather than the kind who opened himself to the full weight of caring about other people, And he had been wrong. He had been wrong in the most grateful and fortunate way. They named him Thomas, after Pearl's father, which was Pearl's suggestion and Harvey's immediate and wholehearted agreement. Thomas Wallace was born into a house full of warmth and books, and the smell of good ironwork, and the sound of two people who loved each other talking, always talking, with the honesty and the interest in each other that had been the beginning of everything between them. He was born into Caldwell, Kansas, in 1883, into a town that felt itself to be part of something being built, imperfectly and with great difficulty, and with the occasional terrible injustice that the frontier was not free of, the violence done to the Comanche and the Cheyenne and the other peoples whose land all of this had been, a wrong that Harvey and Pearl, in their serious conversations, acknowledged as real and irreversible, and that sat at the complicated foundation of everything the settlement of the plains had been, something Pearl taught her students about with an honesty that was not universal among frontier schoolteachers, and that Harvey respected her deeply for. Thomas grew. The year 1884 passed in the particular way that years pass when a child is new in the world, in sleeplessness and wonder, and the accumulating discoveries of a small person encountering everything for the first time. Harvey found that fatherhood, like marriage, like loving Pearl, was nothing like what he would have predicted and everything like what he needed. He was a patient father, steady and present, the kind of father who came home from the forge in the late afternoon and sat on the floor with his son and the wooden blocks he had made for him, and simply existed with him in the contented animal way of fathers and small children. Pearl was a magnificent mother, which surprised no one who knew her, because she was a magnificent teacher and the qualities overlapped in all the most important ways. She was patient and clear and endlessly curious about what Thomas was experiencing, and she talked to him from the very beginning, long before he could answer, in full sentences about the world, as though she was already teaching him the names of things. On Christmas morning of 1884, when Thomas was just over a year old and newly walking and extremely opinionated about everything, Harvey woke early as usual and built the fire and made the coffee, and he went to the box he kept on the high shelf of the bedroom wardrobe and took out what he had been working on for 2 months. It was a gift for Pearl, a pair of iron bookends this time, not one but two, and they were made as a matched set, one book slightly larger than the other, and on the spine of each he had scratched their initials, H.W. and P.W., intertwined. He set them on the kitchen table and put her coffee beside them, and when Pearl came into the kitchen with Thomas on her hip, Thomas already awake and demanding and clutching a piece of dried biscuit in one determined fist, Pearl stopped when she saw the bookends and said nothing for a moment. "Harvey," she said. "Merry Christmas," he said. Pearl set Thomas carefully on the floor where he immediately began an investigation of the chair legs, and she picked up the bookends one at a time and looked at them, at the initials entwined on the spines, and when she looked up her eyes were bright. "The first one you gave me was the most beautiful thing I'd ever been given," she said. "How did you improve on it?" "You," he said simply. "Everything I make now I make better because of you." Pearl looked at him across the kitchen table on Christmas morning with their son on the floor between them and the fire burning and the coffee steaming and the winter light coming through the windows, and she said, "I love you, Harvey Wallace." "I love you, Pearl Wallace," he said. And he crossed the kitchen and kissed her and picked up Thomas, who protested the interruption to his investigation, but was mollified by being held up to look out the window at the Christmas snow falling soft and steady over Caldwell, over the forge and the schoolhouse and the church and the mercantile, over the whole wide-awake, imperfect, hard-won town that was their home. Time continued to do what time does, moving forward with the steady, unconcerned momentum of the years. Pearl continued to teach, and the school grew because the town grew, and she trained 2 younger women who came out to Caldwell to teach the younger grades while she took the older children herself, and she became known throughout the county as the kind of teacher who changed children, who sent them out into the world knowing more about it and about themselves than they would have otherwise. The school board, after some initial friction, came to understand that Pearl Bristol Wallace was the best thing that had happened to Caldwell's educational prospects in its history, and they extended every possible accommodation to keep her. Harvey's reputation as a blacksmith spread through the county as well, and he took on a young apprentice in 1885, a 15-year-old boy named Joseph from a struggling farm family who had a natural feel for the work, and whom Harvey taught with the same quiet patience that old Bauer had once given him, finding the nature of things and working with it rather than against it. Joseph was at the forge every afternoon after school and all day Saturdays, and Harvey found that having someone to teach added something to the work, made him see it newly through the boy's learning. In the spring of 1886, Pearl told Harvey she was expecting again. Harvey was not at the forge this time. He was in the kitchen, which is where he was most often in the evenings now, because Pearl made it the warm center of the house, and it was where Thomas did his reading at the kitchen table, and where Harvey sat across from him helping with sums and spelling while Pearl graded her students' work at the other end, the lamp burning between them and the fire going and the comfortable noise of a house that is lived in fully. "Another one," Harvey said. "Another one," Pearl confirmed. Thomas, who was 2.5 and very observant, looked between his parents with great seriousness. "Another one what?" he asked. "A brother or a sister," Pearl said. Thomas considered this information with the same methodical attention he had inherited from his mother. "I would like a brother," he decided. "I will pass that along," Pearl said gravely, and Harvey laughed. The second child was a girl, born in November of 1886, and Thomas's diplomatic acceptance of this outcome was one of the funniest things Harvey had witnessed in years. The girl was named Alice, which was Harvey's mother's name, and Pearl had suggested it without being asked, and Harvey had been so moved by this that he had needed to step outside for a moment under the November stars and collect himself. Alice Wallace had her father's gray-green eyes and her mother's dark honey hair, and a temperament that was somehow both of theirs and entirely her own, fierce and sweet, and endlessly interested in everything. Thomas, despite his stated preference for a brother, was devoted to her from the first week, appointing himself her guardian and authority on all matters with a seriousness that was both endearing and slightly alarming. The Christmas of 1886, Pearl and Harvey placed Alice, 8 weeks old and wide-eyed and solemn, on the kitchen table between the pair of iron bookends in the lamplight, and Thomas stood beside them proudly, and Harvey took the moment and kept it somewhere inside him where he kept things that were too important to simply pass by. The years that followed were full ones. Full in the way that lives become full when they are being actively lived. The ordinary and the remarkable woven together, the teaching and the forging and the raising of children, and the management of a household, and the town around them growing and changing and bringing new people and new challenges, and the ongoing, complicated work of being part of a community with all its imperfections. Kansas in the 1880s was a place in transition, the open range giving way to farming, the cattle trade that had sustained Caldwell shifting as the railroads pushed further south and west, and the great cattle drives that had defined the town's identity became less frequent and eventually rare. Harvey watched these changes with the steady attention he gave to everything, and Pearl watched them too and wrote about them in the journal she had kept since she was 17, her careful, honest record of a life on the frontier. They were not always easy years. There was a drought in 1887 that hit the farming families around Caldwell very hard, and Pearl organized the school families into a mutual support arrangement that helped several families through the worst of it, and Harvey reduced his rates and extended credit, and contributed to the community fund that the church organized. There were winters that tested the house and the forge and the resources of everyone in town. There were losses, the death of old Doc Emery in 1888, which hit Harvey harder than he expected, because Emery had been one of the few people in Caldwell who had seen him clearly from the beginning. But the years were full, fundamentally and genuinely full, and Harvey Wallace, who had once sat on his porch watching the darkness settle over the prairie and told himself that managing was enough, knew that he had been wrong about that and was grateful every ordinary morning to have been corrected. Thomas grew into a serious, bright boy who loved books with his mother's devotion and had his father's practical hands. And by the time he was 8, he was spending Saturday mornings at the forge with Harvey, learning the fundamental work with the focused patience of someone who genuinely wanted to understand it. He would not, in the end, become a blacksmith. He would eventually go east to study law, something Harvey and Pearl would encourage with everything they had, because they believed in education and in the possibilities it opened, and because Thomas had a mind for argument and justice that would serve him well. Alice grew into a child of tremendous energy and a laugh that could be heard across the schoolyard, and she was her mother's daughter in the schoolroom, which Pearl tried not to make too evident in her assessments, but which was visible to everyone. She was also, somewhat unexpectedly, deeply interested in the natural world, in the plants and animals of the prairie, and Harvey built her a small collection cabinet for her specimens, and she curated it with an orderly passion that delighted him. Christmas remained, through all the years, the center of something important in the Wallace household. It remained the holiday that Harvey felt most, the one that was tied to the memory of the cold windowsill and the covered plate, and the note in Pearl's handwriting that said no, one should be alone on Christmas morning. Pearl knew this, and she made Christmas the fullest day of the year, the table crowded with food she had made herself and later with help from the children, the house smelling of pine boughs and spice, carols sung off-key, and with great enthusiasm, gifts exchanged that were always made or chosen with real thought. And every Christmas morning, Harvey woke before anyone else and built the fire and made the coffee, and Pearl came in and they sat at the kitchen table in the quiet before the children woke, and they held their coffee cups and looked at each other in the winter light, and the gratitude between them was so large and so established and so completely real that it required no words. On the Christmas of 1889, Harvey sat across from Pearl in their kitchen and looked at her. This woman who was 33 years old now and more beautiful to him than she had been the day he met her, not despite the years but including them, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes from squinting at pages and at distant pupils, the way she held her cup with both hands, the dark honey hair shot through now with a thread or two of silver that she wore as simply and without vanity as she wore everything. "What are you thinking?" she asked. The same question she had asked him on their first Christmas morning together. "What I always think on Christmas morning," he said. Pearl smiled. "About the plate," she said. "About the plate," he agreed. "About you standing outside my house in the cold arguing with yourself about whether to leave it." "I was so frightened," Pearl said, still smiling. "Not of you, of myself, of wanting something." Harvey looked at her. "I know," he said. "I was frightened of the same thing." "For much longer," she said gently. "For much longer," he acknowledged. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, as she had so many times over so many mornings, and he turned his palm up and held it, her hand warm and known in his. Above them, from the direction of the children's room, they could hear Thomas beginning to stir, and Alice's voice rising in excited inquiry about the day. And in a few minutes those two would be in the kitchen with their noise and their wanting and their brightness, and the day would begin in earnest. But for this moment, this particular quiet before everything, Harvey and Pearl Wallace sat in their kitchen in Caldwell, Kansas, on Christmas morning of 1889, holding hands across the table, in a life that was full and real and deeply, completely theirs. And Harvey thought about the man he had been before she came, that careful, armored, solitary man sitting on a porch watching the dark come in. And he thought about all the things that had come from a plate left on a windowsill on a cold December morning, All the years and the children, and the laughing and the arguing and the building of things, and the tending of a life together. He thought about how love worked, how it was never the dramatic gesture you expected, but the small, honest one you did not see coming. A woman standing in the cold at 5 in the morning making a decision about a plate of food, and a man alone in a house who needed something he did not know how to ask for. He thought about Pearl Bristol arriving in Caldwell on a broken wagon, composed and serious and already fully herself, and about everything that had followed from that, the axle and the forge and the mercantile conversation about Emerson and the walk along the creek in winter, and the Christmas morning when everything had shifted on its axis. He was 34 years old when she arrived. He had been managing. He had been waiting without knowing he was waiting, and she had come and shown him what he was waiting for, and he had been afraid of it, and then he had chosen it, and it had been, without qualification, the best thing he had ever done. Outside the kitchen windows, the Christmas snow was falling over Caldwell, soft and steady, covering the forge and the schoolhouse and the church and all the ordinary streets of a working frontier town. And inside the kitchen the fire was burning and the coffee was warm and the iron bookend stood on the shelf in the next room between Pearl's books, the one she had made for him first and the pair he had made in return, all of their initials intertwined in good iron. "Merry Christmas, Pearl," Harvey said. Pearl Wallace, née Bristol, schoolteacher of Caldwell, Kansas, wife and mother and the most direct and honest person Harvey had ever known, looked at him across their kitchen table with her dark eyes warm and full and said, "Merry Christmas, Harvey." And that was, in every possible way, enough. Thomas arrived in the kitchen at a run a minute later with Alice right behind him, both of them bright-faced and determined about the day, and the quiet moment folded into the larger noise of Christmas morning with children. And Harvey stood and caught Alice when she launched herself at him and held her up on his hip, and Pearl was already up and moving to the stove, and Thomas was asking about breakfast and whether the snow was deep enough for his sled. And the day that had started in stillness opened into everything a day can be when it is full of people you love. Outside, Caldwell went on. The forge waited for Monday. The schoolhouse waited for January. The wide Kansas prairie held its winter silence around the small, warm town, the same prairie that Harvey had watched from his porch for 6 years in careful, practiced solitude, and which now was simply the beautiful and enormous backdrop to a life that was no longer solitary but was, in every direction, inhabited. Harvey Wallace had never spent a holiday with anyone worth speaking of until a woman left a plate on his windowsill Christmas morning, and what followed from that plate was everything a life should be, full and difficult and joyful and true, and it lasted all the years they had, which were many, and it was more than enough. It was, as it happened, everything.